Continuing this story, which, as I said, I'm excited about, I want to introduce the panel, which will talk about this, what the minister already described, which is this rather ambitious plan of evaluating 34 different policies and having results relatively soon to influence further policy. So that idea that we can do policy research at that scale is really for people like us who are in JPAL extremely exciting. And to tell you a little bit more about what's happening there, I want to invite Milagros Paniagua, who's the General Secretary of Social Inclusion in the Ministry of Inclusion, Social Security and Migration for Spain. She started as a software developer, but soon realized that research is better and joined the Ministry of Statistics, and then has been was a leader in the various data collection efforts on social inclusion and on living conditions, and was eventually joined the Instituto de Estudios Fiscal, where she developed microsimulation models to assess the impact of benefit and tax models on inequality and poverty, where she collaborated with the DG European funds, and has since also worked with various Latin American and North African governments. So I'm very pleased to have her here. Will you join us on stage? I then want to invite Mónica Martínez-Bravo. Mónica is Professor of Economics at CEMFI and got her PhD in economics from MIT. She's the winner in 2021 of the Banco Sabadell Award for the Best Spanish Economist Under 40. Mónica, will you please join us on stage? And finally, but last but not the least, Samuel Bentolila. And this might sound like I'm misreading, but is Professor of Economics at CEMFI and got his PhD from MIT. There's no bias here. This is just the objective reality that MIT is better. He has been president of the Spanish Economic Association and is has been a member of the panel of economic policy. Samuel, will you join us on stage? And with that, I will also... We're supposed to have a discussion. It's a little bit of an awkward seating arrangement for a discussion, but Collège de France was founded before discussions were invented. What we want to do in this 50-odd minutes is first have each of my three co-panelists present a little bit of some piece of this wonderful project, with maybe an emphasis on one specific project that excites them, and then have a discussion on the general what it means to do a project like this and where it can go. So with that, I want to invite Mila to speak first.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Banerjee, and thank you very much to JPAL for inviting me to your 20th anniversary celebration. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to share with you this policy lab that we have built up in Spain. And to do so, I will follow a very short presentation where I will first speak about the framework where this policy lab takes place, Then I will go for the Policy Lab main features, the description. Then one of the things I think which is very important in this Policy Lab, which is the governance. And then I will cover who is in this Policy Lab procedure and also how we do it, not only the members, but also how we need to work together to make this possible. And also, whenever you run a project, you have always a lesson learned, and I will cover these first lessons learned from this Policy Lab. Now, the framework. To explain the framework where this Policy Lab is, I need to go for the inclusion policy. The inclusion policy, to give you an idea, in the structure of the welfare state, the inclusion policy is like the last safety net, where you have this double target of supporting income for the most vulnerable households, and at the same time you want to help them in the transition to inclusion. Now, this, let's say, inclusion policy, named like this, started with the new government in 2020. But let me give you an idea of how this inclusion policy was before 2020. And I've brought here some figures about the Spanish context for you to see how this inclusion policy was deployed before 2020. Now we are around, Spain has around 18.5 million households and 47 million people. Now we are a country very high decentralized, so that we are the central government, administration, 17 regions, the autonomous communities, and more than 8,000 municipalities. Now, what about poverty in Spain in 2019? If we measure with at-risk of poverty rate, we can see that it was 25.3% in 2019. And it was the regions, the autonomous communities, the ones in charge of covering the most vulnerable. The thing is that depending on the region you were living, you were having different programs. So I would say the situation was very unequal depending on the place you were living at. Now, in 2020, we deployed the inclusion policy, and this inclusion policy had two main pillars. The first one was there to cover income, and we deployed a national minimum income scheme. I could say that we are today covering around 3.5% of the households in Spain, but I would go to the main elements I like to focus on, which is we now have a common definition for vulnerability in Spain, which has been very useful for situations like the Ukrainian crisis, where we've been able to identify the most vulnerable for transfers. And at the same time, we have a targeted benefit, because we're not giving the same money to everyone. We are identifying different households, and depending on a pre-existing condition and the guaranteed income to different households, we are doing different things. We are targeting. Also, we give special treatment and focus on children and single-parent families, and we've made this minimum income scheme compatible with work from the beginning. This means that the minimum income scheme, the amount of money will depend on existing income from work, either employed or self-employed. But at the same time, we want to give incentives to work. It's not only to make it compatible, but also to give incentives to work. Now, we've done one of the things which is most important for us, which is understanding the non-take-up, the main reasons why people apparently fulfilling the requirements don't end up asking the minimum income scheme. But we have not only worked on understanding, but also we've run different projects to minimize this non-take-up. A lot of effort put in these projects. Now, that's the main pillar. And then The second pillar is the inclusion. We wrote from the beginning in the law how we understood inclusion should be. The minister has said before, when referring and pointing to two projects, we needed to go to field with somebody else. And the thing is, we had a national perspective competence. And to go for an inclusion project, we need to work with somebody else. We need to work with administrations, with regions, with municipalities, and also with NGOs. Now, with this structure, at the end of 2020, we were negotiating with the European Commission the Next Generation funds, and we got to have this policy lab. A policy lab that wants to learn. That's the target. We want to provide evidence, and that's what we're trying to do. We are working closely with JPAL and my colleagues of CEMFI, which is a leading institution in research funded by the Bank of Spain. Now, this is the Policy Lab, a very briefly summary. We are investing from 2021 to 2023. We are investing more than 200 million euros, trying to cover around 200,000 people. We need to go all over Spain, all over the country, because it's a national-wide policy, and we are covering all the group of people, different collectives. We have, can't read well, children and also teenagers. We have women, we have unemployed, and we have migrants as well. We are covering different dimensions. We want to work on the inclusion from different dimensions, so we are doing a lot of training and counseling. We are working on social employment and so on. And I wanted to point as well at the third column, when referring to education also, the activities that have been talked about today in previous sessions, which are very much related to tutoring. Now, the governance, we need to do this with the administration and with the NGOs, and you can see the distribution of our partnership. And now this is who is working on this policy lab. We have a major driver. We are the ones to run the project, the ministry, particularly the Department for Inclusion, the Secretary General, but then we need to work with someone else. As I said, we need regional governments, local government, and also the third sector. The NGOs, of course, are strategic partners for the methodology part, JPAL and CEMFI. And we also have an ethic committee, because since we are doing experiment, we have randomized controlled trials, we need to have this ethic committee. And also we have an advisory committee in the Secretary General, because not only for this policy lab, but for the rest of the policies we're in charge of, like designing the minimum income scheme, we always like to bring to this committee our findings to have their feedback. Now, it's not only who, but also how, all along the way, from the design to the evaluation, we need to be working together at different intensities. You have down there as well the tight timing, because we need to end up presenting the European Commission. I'm going to stop. We will need to end up presenting the European Commission 18 good practices. Now, very quickly, some lessons learned. I'll go to the second one, because when you're a policymaker and you start running your programs, the question is, do we want to be fast or we want to be effective? We need to have some times of planning. But if you do this planning, from the theory to the reality, there's always an implementation gap, not only in the projects, but also in the administrative procedures. But these two bullets could be part of any public policy, could serve as lesson learned. I would keep my attention with the third one, which has been presented by the minister before, about the social investment. I like this policy lab because of the importance of human capital investment. In particular, these programs focus on the most vulnerable. I like to finish where we work this policy lab. This is our office in Madrid, where we have this beautiful sentence from Esther Duflo. I wanted to show you where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for staying. And also happy anniversary to JPAL. I'm thrilled to be here. All right, so I want to also explain a little bit more about the policy lab in Spain, but perhaps more from the perspective of researchers. But even before that, I think it's useful to try to give some context along the same lines of what Milagros was trying to say. Because if you go back to 2019, Spain has been a country in which social spending has not been as high as a fraction of GDP as in many other countries. But if you also look at within social spending, what Spain was traditionally spending on was typically pensions and unemployment. But if you look, for instance, in the graph, social exclusion, funding specific to social exclusion was very limited when, far below the European average, right? So this government and this ministry in particular comes in 2020 and decides or tries to change radically the picture with the establishment of a new social benefit, the minimum income scheme, that provides a cash transfer and increases substantially cash transfers to low-income population, right? So here, sorry, it's not very clear, but here you could see how, as a percentage of the median income, what is the guaranteed income that low-income households have in different countries in 2019, and how this has changed before and after the implementation of this minimum scheme that, as Milagros said, it now reaches 3.5% of households in Spain, right? So massive expansion in a very important social benefit at that point in time in which we have the massive impact of COVID, particularly harsh for low-income families. But this ministry, even went beyond that. It's not, they were not satisfied with launching this big cash transfer targeting low-income people. They went beyond by saying, we also need to do much more, right? And I welcome very much this approach. It goes along what Esther and Abhijit and many of the people here have underscored often, that poverty is a multi-phenomenal problem which cannot be only addressed with cash, right? Or there could be other interventions that are necessary. But that also calls for a new paradigm, right? Because if in addition to cash you need to do something else, you need to figure out what, right? And then that comes very naturally to the topic of let's figure out what works, right? So I think that just being here with the JPAL crowd and the ministry crowd, I think it's very fantastic to see how these two approaches came together in the setting of Spain. Okay, so the ministry decided to spend 300 million euros to pilot interventions to fight against poverty, to promote social exclusion, and to see what works, right? So it embraces a natural kind of a skepticism. We don't know what works, let's test it, right? Furthermore, it kind of marries with a specific methodology. So they write in law that this funding is to run randomized controlled trials, right? And then in terms of scale, it's also unprecedented within Spain and perhaps in Europe as well, right? So, in the spring of 2021, we learned about this. By the way, Spain is a country which has very little trajectory in terms of evaluation of public policies, not to speak of randomized controlled trials. There is very little prior experience with randomized controlled trials. And as researchers in the spring of 2021, we learned that the ministry spent 300 million euros on running RCTs. So I remember talking to Samuel and saying, who is doing this? We need to jump on board and we need to help them to make sure that this goes the best possible way. In that minute, I also emailed Esther and Abhijit saying the exact same message. I don't understand why this is happening. It's better than we ever dream of. We need to help in making it the most out of it. So this translated into CEMFI, both CEMFI and JPAL signing memorandums of understanding with the ministry and offering our help. Abhijit also came in the summer of 2022, met the Prime Minister, and that was also a big endorsement. So one of the things that, when we signed this agreement, we started being more involved. The first set of projects was already the first the projects, these 34 projects were split more or less in half between 2 rounds of funding. The first round of funding had been already there, and they were in the middle of deciding who gets the second round of funding, right? So one of the things that I told to them with a lot of insistence is that researchers have to get there early in terms of deciding what are going the projects to be, who is going to get the money, and so on. That was my obsession, right? So, the saying goes like saying, be careful with what you wish for, because one week I started getting emails inviting me to meetings with potential partners. These meetings tend to last for 2 or 3 hours, and I kept getting these emails. And then I said, but how many meetings there are? It's like, oh, don't worry, there are 15 meetings. I was like, 15 meetings? No, 15 meetings this week. And I was like, oh my goodness, I cannot do this by myself, right? So then, thankfully, I got on board with many great researchers, mostly based in Spain, that joined in this initiative from many different universities. And what we have done is to try to help the ministry on the evaluation on many different tasks, right? I have little time, but I wanted to also use this opportunity to reflect on something that I think is important and goes beyond what we're doing in Spain, which is this question on the governance structure. What role should researchers play? Because in standard or in most RCTs, there is an implementing partner, local and regional governments or NGOs. That was also the case in Spain. So the actual entities that are implementing the programs is not the central government ministry, are these regional partners, right? So in most RCTs, the research team engages with these partners, and then things happen, as most of you have a lot of experience. But in the policy lab, things have been a little different, right? The research team has been providing support to the ministry, and it's the ministry, the ones that communicate with the implementing partners, right? To some extent, the initial framework, as I understood it, was influenced to a great extent by the concept of more of an ex-post evaluation, right? They needed to preserve the independence of the evaluator, and we're thinking of researchers and the ministry as the ones that, from a distance, evaluate the final product. But of course, those of us that have been involved in RCTs, we know that that distance sometimes is not ideal, right? Because there are a lot of details in the design, in the inception, in the identifying of the question, that it's key to have the researcher there from the very beginning, right? So I think there are pros and cons in terms of this potential, having this potential distance. But what I think is that, so the main pro, and the reason why I think that perhaps this model was not very suboptimal for the Spanish case, is the ministry has the upper hand, right? There were a lot of these potential partners that had very limited experience with RCTs and very limited commitment to RCTs. So perhaps partnering with the ministry and the ministry having the upper hand, they have more bargaining power relative to researchers. But my view is that for the discipline implementing partners that do really want to do a good RCT, this distance from the research team, it's probably not optimal. So thinking of moving forward, I think that's a good, something that I would like to also get the feedback from all of you on how, once we have RCTs from government, what is the right role of researchers, right? One potential alternative model, this is more to start the discussion, could be that the ministry in subsequent rounds of funding could play this role as the matchmaker between potential partners and researchers, as well as to play a role of selecting the projects. But I also, this is my own reflection through the last months, I also wonder whether there is something even, even necessary to go even farther from that, right? Because perhaps in a 1 or 2 or 3 days conference, this matchmaking might not flow, right? I think that it's the very frequent conversation between partners, but also social workers, but also the underserved communities themselves, but also learning about the policy priorities, what might be more conductive to finding good ideas for our cities, but also good insights on how to improve policies, right? So perhaps what I think Spain needs very badly, and perhaps other countries, is to have stable organizations that could lead to incubators of projects and to facilitate this communication between researchers and ministries and other potential governments. So I'm out of time, but I can tell you in the Q&A about this exciting project that we are engaged in, Exciting Our City, which is one of the 34. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mónica.
Right, thank you. I want to start by congratulating Jaypal on its birthday, and to say that coordinating with Mónica CEMFI's participation in this venture with the Ministry of Inclusion and Jaypal has been really a great learning experience for me. I'm not a development economist, I'm not a randomista, so I'm a labor economist, and I'd never run an RCT in my life. So it seems that maybe you can teach an old dog some new tricks. Jaypal is reflecting on its 20 years of promoting evidence for policy impact. I'm going to reflect on more than 30 years of trying to interact with policymakers in evaluating policy in the light of the Policy Lab. And then if I have time, I will briefly talk about a project I'm involved in. So my very first experience was in 1991. I was appointed member of a committee that was formed by the government to try to study the impact of fixed-term contracts in Spain, which were a big issue, 1/3 of all contracts, so of all employees. So then we were given data, we were given an array, we worked for 4 months, we handed in a report, period. Then nothing happened. Then 2 years later, the same government did exactly the opposite of what we recommended. We recommended having the maximum duration of these contracts from 3 years to 2 years. They extended it to 4.5 years, okay? And then only 15 years later, they reduced it to 2 years. So much for policy influence. As was said already, the main steps in this recent inclusion policy has been the creation of the minimum income scheme and then these projects, the Policy Lab. So I'm going to try to show you that this experience has been the absolute opposite of what I just described. I'm going to highlight 4 aspects. One is the design as a randomized controlled trials for all the pilots. The policymakers considered that having a rigorous evaluation was valuable, and they were also willing to bear the political cost of a potential negative outcome in these projects. And my experience tells me that this type of behavior, evaluating, is fragile because it depends on very specific people like Minister Escrivá, people like Milagros here, that at some point decide to have an evaluation. So the first lesson would be that we should build resilience in making evaluations part of the institutional setup, something like what Mónica said in her last slide. And we have a new law in Spain that is mandating evaluation. Well, there was a first experience, didn't go well, so we'll see if the second one succeeds. The second aspect is getting the funding from the EU, the Next Generation EU funds. And there are other two commitments, which is important, which is actually carrying out the RCTs and then giving a deadline, which is actually very close, is March 2024 for those 18 projects. And this should shield the project from political interference. We're having new elections now, so we'll see. But the EU could play this role in incorporating higher standards of evaluation in the funding that it gives. The third aspect is bringing researchers on board from the start. Well, it was not really from the start. I mean, I talked to Minister Escrivá about 4 months before we joined. He was already mentioning JPAL. So they wanted to bring researchers in from the start. Then it took a while longer, but eventually it happened. And we had different knowledge, goals, restrictions, attitudes in the ministry team and the CEMFI team, not to speak of the counterparts. And there were some frictions, but still we managed to cooperate, and I think this is very, very valuable. And then they are getting very good evaluations, and we are getting access to data, papers, and helping society. So what can we ask for more? Here, something that does not come easy to me is, be humble like dentists, as Keynes said, or as plumbers, as Esther said. So that's something that I recommend, I learned in this process. And the last point is helping counterparts to implement the methodology of RCTs. This has taken a lot of time and effort on both our parts, but I think this is useful. This is an investment. Now we hope there's going to be a wider culture of evaluation, and there's some people out there now that know how to run RCTs, and this is a capital stock, human capital stock that hopefully will pay off. And the last point is push, but be patient, because some of these efforts may take some time to bear fruit. So now, in my last minute about this project, this is a wonderful project. It's called Customized Employment to Support the Labor Inclusion of People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in Spain. The counterpart is Confederación Plena Inclusión España. It's an NGO. And, people with disabilities, not just intellectual, but any, 1/3 of them are at risk of poverty and social exclusion, vis-a-vis around 1/4 for the population at large. And their employment rate is only 18%, okay? Whereas the average is, people without disabilities is like 2/3. So this is very much needed. So the treatment is something called customized employment. It was developed 20 years ago by the US Department of Labor, and the idea is to integrate these people to employment and social inclusion, and essentially the professional helps them discover their strengths and their interests. Then it matches them with companies, and then if they find a job, they support them in that process. And we're trying to evaluate many aspects which are very interesting, like the effectiveness of this treatment vis-a-vis the traditional one, which is the one that the control group are getting, the role of these persons themselves, their families, the professionals, and the companies, the impact of search and also finding a job on inclusion and well-being, and then we will try to carry out a small cost-benefit analysis. So I think it's going to be really fascinating. Thank you.
We move to the panel discussion part of this last but penultimate session of the day. I guess let me start with a question from Mila. This, JPAL on his website, it says more than 1,600 RCTs. There's evidence, lots of evidence. As someone who, comes from a
statistics background, what would it take to, do you think that the evidence is usable as is? Do you think that there's a ways and reasons why people don't use the evidence as much? Is there, I mean, this is not just the evidence that you are generating. It's, you know, we have a whole world of potential evidence. Is there something that we could do better, or is it, you know, what are the constraints in using evidence in government?
First of all, I think evidence is very useful, and particular evidence. I mean, for me, the problem is that policymakers are far from that evidence. We need to work, I would say we need to work together, as we've explained during this session. But at the same time, I think the policymaker needs to understand that the evaluation is from the very beginning when designing. And in my experience, I think when you are making a new policy, your identification of what's going to happen, first of all, you need to set targets. What do you want to get when doing this? How you're going to measure that? And this ex ante, this impact assessment is crucial. But what I think is we tend to follow a very administrative procedure for fulfilling all the documents accompanying this new law. And I think it's not only working closely the policymaker with the academics, but at the same time, the policymaker needs to feel that it's useful. And let me give you the example of the development of the minimum income scheme, because we've been thinking a long time about this, and we needed to go very, very fast because of the pandemic, but we had studied a lot about the pre-existing system, the one that I showed in the beginning of my presentation. We needed to go fast. I said, you want to be effective or fast? We had already studied about this before. But the good thing to me, although there's always room for improvement, is that we haven't looked at what was going on during the development of this regulation of the minimum income scheme. And we have changed a lot. Of course, we make mistakes, but the good thing, and it is exciting when you're making policy, you make mistakes, but if you don't stop to look at what you're doing, and you correct, and you change that, I mean, everybody makes mistakes, but you cannot stop looking at what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Samuel, I thought given your very long experience in working with governments, what do we, as academics, is there something we could do better? In presenting the evidence, in participating in conversations? Is there something that you feel that maybe JPAL could do better, or in general academics don't do well? I mean, we have this, yes, there isn't enough evidence ever, but there's still a lot of evidence that often doesn't get used. So any thoughts on that, on what makes that hard? I mean, this partnership is exciting, and partly for that, because that in a sense, we not only think we are generating evidence, it's also we think that the evidence we feed into a policy process. There's lots of evidence that doesn't seem to directly feed into a policy process. So is there some thoughts on that?
Yes, well, I think that sometimes we are not often we are not very clear in transmitting the evidence to policymakers, and moreover, usually policies have trade-offs. So you're going to benefit some group of the population, you're going to harm some other group, and usually the politicians are aware of this, but often as economists, we're not very good at giving them a sense of magnitude. So, okay, these people are going to be harmed, but by how much? And these people are going to improve by how much? Is this Pareto improving or not? Sometimes we we have a hard time doing that, and then they say, well, with 200 economists, I cannot move. Oh? The other thing is that, in my experience talking to them, sometimes they don't see the issues, but I think mostly they do know what's involved, and by explaining to them, you get there. But they always worry about annoying either their voters or their allies. For example, the allies could be maybe labor unions, say. And so in my attempts to try to push for labor market reforms in Spain over many years, this is what was really on their mind and what really stopping them. And what I think we could do better is we typically don't try as hard into getting the evidence as into getting what would be politically viable proposals. So we think, okay, this is what should be done, this is the right policy, but we don't really work as much into telling them, okay, so this could be implemented in a number of ways, and probably this one is the one that your voters would buy. Okay, so that's what I can distill.
So in a sense, you're arguing for a more active role of the researcher in policy design.
Yes.
That it's not just say that here's the evidence, do it. You have to take the next step.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's something that to us looks totally, out of our bounds, but there's often like the legal aspects of the proposals, and then you propose something, and then a lawyer comes and says, no, this cannot be done. This is unconstitutional, which is what we got from one of the policy proposals for labor reform. It's not true, but you really have to invest with lawyers and understanding yourself what are the legal aspects and how to circumvent these vetoes that are going to be posed.
Mónica, you seem to be.
Yes, can I add that? Because I think it's a very important question. So I think that I agree with your point that we need a better understanding of what is politically feasible, but that will not come out of a vacuum, right? So I think that related to what you said, I think that a key component is to build relationships of trust with key policy makers. And because it's not I don't think that it's so much a matter of not having the evidence or the evidence not being a meta-analysis or being a particular form. It's more of a matter of finding the right window, sitting with them, understanding all the constraints. And one thing that I really liked, and I think that Samuel might also share, is that going through an RCT is actually a very good way of building those relationships, right? And actually, I feel very close to some of to Mila, but also to some of her staff that works day to day. And I know that if tomorrow they move to another department and they are thinking about how to design something and have that relationship, it's going to be so much easier to say, Mónica, we're thinking about doing this. How do you think is the best way? And then I could get the evidence or talk to someone that I know knows and influence that.
So you want, as you said before, that's part of this idea of institutionalization, that there is a place where you can have conversations which are more ongoing, where the nuances can be maybe slowly communicated. Changing tacks a bit, since we are going to be short of time. Mila, can I ask the sort of the obvious and awkward question, which is, what happens if the evidence shows that some of your programs don't work? Or do you have a game plan for that? I mean, they might. I mean, it's always possible.
Well, if something doesn't work, it is an evidence itself. That's
Absolutely.
a very good evidence. I think we need to be very careful what the evidence that we find in this policy lab. We need to be very conscious that we've run this in a very, very short time. And when you work in social process, you need time. And some of the results won't be identified now. Of course, we will have a lot of evidence, but the good thing is that the policy lab is the process itself. The process of having built a new way of thinking, because having the policy maker so involved in the procedure, in evaluation, I think it's the highest achievement. And not only the ministry, we've learned a lot. Also working with the regions, the municipalities, and the NGOs who were not aware of working this way. I can let you know, because the many researchers here, I'll give you an example, a very detailed issue, which is, okay, do not send me KPIs to identify whether you did well or not the process. Send me the microdata and send me the microdata with this information. I want to see all the registers, the individual, and all the characteristics, and then I will be able to build up the KPI. Many of them didn't know how to do it. It's taken us a while to set up the baseline, so we are running for everyone to be ready, sending the baseline information, because at the end of this year, everybody needs to finish the project. So we need to rev up to be ready for them to send us again the last piece of information at the end of the project. So I think it is crucial to have run this project. I find the Policy Lab itself as the cornerstone of something else.
Thank you. Samuel, you say, I want to go back to what you said, which is that, you know, it's very important as a policy that you get down to the right level of detail. When I talk to some of my colleagues, they have the opposite view, that it blinds you as an economist. You see too many details, so you don't understand that it's what's the essential economics of it. So there's some tension between useful research and high-quality research. As someone who has stayed in many worlds of research, you've done macroeconomic research, labor market. So tell me what you think.
I disagree. I don't see that discrepancy. I think that when I've approached some policy issues, mostly in the Spanish labor market, which are big problems, I always wrote a model, estimated it, got my conclusions, and then I went into how to implement it, knowing the details. But I for example, during the Great Recession, we had an initiative of Spanish labor economists that was very much in the media and so on. And then we sort of had the research already. We distilled it into a specific manifesto. And then we went to the parties, political parties, and we told them, listen, we want to talk to you. We have these proposals. We want to know what you think, etc. Didn't turn out so well, because they said, essentially, we don't want to meet with you, but you can meet with our lawyers, which we did. And I think, even so, I think that was useful, because then we got to see what was the reaction, which was mostly partly legal, partly political. And we learned, we reformed the proposal in a way that then became much more palatable. Actually, one of the parties adopted it in its platform, and he went to the elections with this proposal. He didn't succeed, and so on. And then we also got, the 2 days before the labor reform, four of us met with the Prime Minister. But that was PR, so I don't count that as policy influence, but anyway. But no, I think you have to have first the research well done, and then have the practical proposals.
On that, Mónica, continuing, you are a political economist, and so there's a conversation which is with the government about being useful. There's also a conversation with the public, always, in placing research, in involving the public in intellectual and policy debates, so that the public takes ownership of. is the RCT a useful tool in that? How do you see you're now moving into doing RCTs? Is there a sense in which you feel that this is going to either help you or hinder you? I mean, how does it go?
Well, I think that in about 6 months we will have a good, good evaluation of that, because we will see how we are able to transmit the results of this big initiative. I mean, I think that one of the beauties of RCTs is its simplicity, right? So I hope that we should kind of leverage that in terms of communicating to people, and perhaps you should answer that question in terms of thinking of how people in many other settings understood and embraced that. I mean, I wish that, there was, in addition to understanding the very simple methodology, I wish that there was a little bit more of an appreciation of the rigor that science brings, right? And in my wish list, even that people acknowledge that there are better publications within economics or within any social sciences, because I think that bringing science into the evaluation, it's very, very important, and actually that's one of the big struggles that I think Spain is going to face, because there is some people that understand evaluation in very different words than we do, right, in terms of causal identification and producing good evidence, right? And I think that scientific component would be important because it brings us independence, right? We trust more the findings, and I think that's what people should value. But building a good reputation in science and in good rigorous evaluation, I think that's hard, but we could try to see if we could push that, at least in Spain, in the next months.
Great. Time moves very fast in this session. I saw that it was 5 minutes, 2 minutes ago, then it's become 1 minute. It moves faster in this hall than elsewhere. Nonetheless, I want to ask Mila one last question, which is, there is an election coming up, things might change. What of this you think would survive, and if so, why would you be optimistic, and if so, why?
I am optimistic. I think the policy lab will end up successfully. And indeed, I think once we get to the end, that's not the end, that's the beginning of something else. We will need to show the evidence and make the future policymakers, wherever, any administration, to understand what randomized controlled trial is, what providing evidence is, and try to make them use the results when making policy. There's something I'd like to say. I'm very optimistic about this policy lab because it's going to finish soon. But to run the policy lab, you need to have the initiative. And we had the initiative of Minister Escrivá. So not everybody wants to run these sort of projects. We are happy that we had this chance. I'm sure we will be able to have more in the future. Indeed, I didn't have time in my presentation, but it's written in the slides, which is the addendum of the next generation. There will be an addendum, and the European Commission has seen how much Spain has been working on this policy lab. So I think there's still room to keep on doing these policy labs.
Can I
Yeah,
I mean,
but you have minus 1 minute.
Minus 1 minute, yes. The addendum has a last name, which is 2.5 billion has been allocated to scale up this policy. So I think that's very good news.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I will, now that I've actually used the false time that I assigned to ourselves, I will say thank you to the three of you. It's been a great session and could have been an even longer great session. Thank you.